I'd like to introduce our last panel, our third last panel. Along with Philip and Kate, we have immediately next to me Hans Hesseline, who is the director of the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and a nonprofit organization. We have next to him Debbie Mans, who is a member of New York, New Jersey Bay Keeper, and she is the executive director of the Oyster Restoration Program. And we have, down at the end, we have Dave Averin, who is Chief of Natural Resources for National Park Service, Gateway District. Yeah, we've sort of invited all these guests because I think they have a very unique take on how the public might be involved in the dredge cycle and different organizations through which they work. So that's sort of how we brought all these diverse people together.
So for our first question, I think we want to pick up on kind of that thread that we saw running through your work, which is that in contrast to the sort of large corporate and large governmental actors that we've been talking about or hearing from through most of the day, your work seems to all, in some measure, find ways to bring the public into these landscapes and find ways for the public to participate, often in regenerative processes on them. So I was hoping that each of you might talk a little bit about how it is that what you do intersects with the public, and how it is that you maybe try to bring the public into your work. So maybe if we could start with you, Hans, and just head on down the line.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. This is exciting. So I work for the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and I think that first of all, it's very important. Well, our organization focuses on traditional project implementation, through the sort of regulating agencies and EPA, DEP, DEC, whatever, Army Corps, but also we think that engaging the community in sort of environmental restoration projects is both really useful way, a really useful way to accomplish change. But also it's really empowering for the community members themselves, and I think I learned that firsthand because I started out as a volunteer for the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and got engaged in developing projects where we were working, just sort of implementing our own green projects as we saw fit as community volunteers, and things like cleaning up street ends, removing trash and debris from abandoned urban spaces, and regenerating them as, I guess, productive ecological areas with really a focus on stormwater management and trying to reduce combined sewer overflows into the Gowanus Canal, which is like one of the most significant issues that we have to deal with, and also is the main source, I guess, of sedimentation in the Gowanus Canal that tie it back to the whole dredging issue. So lots of, I think, I'm not sure what to say beyond that, but so, thank you.
So New York, New Jersey Bay Keeper, we've been around since 1989, and we're part of a larger waterkeeper organization. There's about 200 internationally, and we're one of the founding groups, and we're essentially the voice for the waterway. We're an environmental advocacy organization, and we have 3 core programs that we work in: advocacy and mitigation. We sued over dredging practices in the New York Harbor, and we settled with the Army Corps, and we're having monthly calls, and it's lovely. We do urban land restoration and stewardship, especially in riparian areas. And we have an oyster restoration and research project. So that is really where I see a lot of the intersection here. We're trying to get these things in the ground, and the obstacles we face with the regulations, with public nuisance. People are going to come and take the oysters and get sick and ruin the industry. These are all things we see. And so it's nice to come to something like this where it's more visionary and inspiring, because we kind of get down in the trenches a bit and maybe a little discouraged about what we can do. And so the collaborations, I think, between practitioners and advocacy groups and the landscape architect community is important. And the way we get the public involved is all the ways that we all interact within the community, but it's critical to us as an advocacy organization. I have no authority to do what I do and to tell people to do what I want them to do, and all I have is the public to bring me my position forward to elected officials, to the regulators. So it's critical for us to get the public on our side about what we want to do. I mean, in New Jersey, we were told we had to stop our oyster restoration projects by the state. And it was because of public pressure and elected officials that we engaged that we're now able to get back into the water. So that's why we engage the public.
With science funding in the U.S. right now, certainly with federal funding, there's a big movement toward having science interact with people. And so, and a lot of scientists are groaning about that. But personally, I feel like I'm in a very good position because being in an urban area with 20 million people, it's a really exciting place to be. And that's sort of why I am a scientist in New York, is because I want to be a scientist for public good. So that's, I think that's only going to help our group, our research group at Stevens Institute. And so one way is to interact and try to get ideas from people, learn if our crazy ideas are acceptable to communities. We'll be doing that for sure with ideas for Jamaica Bay, for example. Whether or not people would want the Jamaica Bay to be shallowed by 50%, I realize that'd be an uphill battle to get. Change is usually a negative for people. But then, on the other hand, we also want to use our model to help people visualize, what a hurricane that hasn't happened in 130 years would do. And so that's something I really see as a big, exciting thing I could move into, is to work on visualization. Like that animation I showed of the storm surge, well, what if you could zoom in on that and look at your house, and the water elevation, either animated as it occurs or just the peak water elevations, and see what it really means. And so bringing these things home for people to maybe make it so that we don't only respond after the bad flood would be a really valuable thing we can do.
I'll speak briefly and then transition to speak, but I probably speak for a lot of the designers in the room where I showed that megaport plan for a reason, and that was that there was a certain moment in history where there was an incredible amount of investment and going into infrastructure, but it was often top down. But what frustrates me, I think, is that I think we need both levels. We need the bottom-up community work, but we also need big pressure and we need big projects and ideas to kind of bring these two ends of the spectrum together. And what I think the promise is, which I think we're hopefully going to see in the next 10 years for remaking Jamaica Bay, but I think that landscape has incredible promise to, we should be thinking as big as that, but in a different way, I think, and that there should be as much funding and enthusiasm and kind of, a vision, which is a kind of a new vision for that landscape. And I think that's not only community-based and ground up, but that has to do with big thinking.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I represent one of those really large organizations. So I am the Chief of Resources for Gateway National Recreation Area, which is part of the National Parks system, and Jamaica Bay, which I'll focus on today. Gateway actually is a pretty big part of the New York area. It has pieces in Sandy-Hook, New Jersey, and pieces in Staten Island, and a bunch of pieces in Brooklyn and Queens, and I'm really excited to see that Jamaica Bay is really the focus of what's going on today in terms of design. One reason why there are two really good reasons why we need to engage the public in what goes on in national parks, and particularly Jamaica Bay. The first is that it's the law. We're required to do that by our own policies and regulations, and any major action that we do in Jamaica Bay requires that we engage the public. National Environmental Policy Act requires that. Gateway is presently undergoing a general management planning exercise, which will guide us for the next 20 years, and that'll be an environmental impact statement. But more importantly, Jamaica Bay is at the end of the line. It's downstream of everything. It's downstream of millions of people in Brooklyn and Queens. Our watershed that feeds Jamaica Bay is something like 45 square miles. So without public participation and interest in what happens in Jamaica Bay or in any park, we're really fighting a losing battle. So we spend a lot of energy working with the school groups because we think that's really a real important way to engage the public, to get future constituents. We spend a lot of time trying to create a sense of stewardship on the part of not only the present users of Jamaica Bay, the recreationists, the bird watchers, the kayakers, that sort, but also people that maybe have never been to Jamaica Bay and they want to come to Jamaica Bay, and also folks that are like non-traditional park user groups from areas in New York City that you wouldn't associate with folks that would come to Jamaica Bay to enjoy recreation there. The other point I want to make, and it really doesn't relate to this, is that in Jamaica Bay, it's interesting that this is a festival of dredge, and if you look at Jamaica Bay and its current qualities and makeup, it is for the most part a very created environment, and it's a real challenge for the National Park Service because you don't generally associate a national park with a created environment. And the same policies and that guide how Gateway preserves and protects natural resources going into the future are the same ones that guide Yellowstone, Yosemite, and whatnot. And listening to some of the presentations about terraforming and creating islands that may not have been there before, or creating significant changes in the environment that maybe are not natural or duplicating what was once the natural environment in Jamaica Bay is a very difficult push for the National Park Service. And it's something very different, and we're learning as we go forward, and sessions like this help us think way more creatively in urban environments.
That's actually a perfect segue into the next thing that we wanted to ask about, which is, and I might say before I ask this question, that since we've opened up the windows, it would be great if everyone could kind of lean into the mic a little bit more and project a little bit more, because I think it's going to be a little harder to hear now. So I'll try to do that myself. In the very beginning, the first question that Tim asked of the first panel had to do with sort of aesthetics and design questions related to the creation of these new landscapes like you're talking about, Dave. And Lisa kind of brought up this same barrier that you're talking about, which is kind of a barrier of public perception, and this perception that the only place that we can do regenerative work is within the confines of history in the work. So we need to sculpt whatever kind of regenerative work we do to match the contours of previously extant things. So the question that I kind of pose to you guys is, do you see any place, maybe within your work or within public participation in these kinds of landscapes where the presence of the public might alter the public's perception in such a way as to open up new possibilities or open up sort of a receptiveness to the kinds of new configurations that, I don't know, that you were talking about, Dave, or that you were talking about in your work, Phil? Go ahead.
Okay, so I want to say that when we engage community members and the public in implementing small, discrete, but I think very interesting environmental projects, like I said, guerrilla gardening. We build guerrilla bioswales in the goannas because, you know, there's a tremendous need for green space to sort of help manage the stormwater issue that we're dealing with. But engaging people in these projects is really, really critical because not only do we accomplish things, but also it helps people to understand. It helps people to understand some of the underlying issues that an organization like the Gowanus Canal Conservancy is trying to address. People. Could be my phone.
Turn
a cell phone near the microphone.
People turn off their phones, it might help.
Anyway, so just by the process of engaging people in developing and implementing these projects, we really make them aware of the fact that they live within this watershed, which is actually a sewer shed, and that, you know, water that lands on their roof or on their sidewalk has a very big impact on the Gowanus Canal, and everything that they flush down their toilet or wash down their sink usually ends up there when it rains. And so I would say that, yeah, these community projects that we're working on are very significant in terms of their effect on public perception, and that's a really valuable tool for us.
I think historically there has been a lot of mistrust between the communities and the regulatory agencies. But that being said, there are core leaders within the communities that are very actively engaged on this, especially in Jamaica Bay. And they're very smart. I mean, they're all volunteers, but they get it. And to the extent that they can be brought into the process and educated about what you want to do, but in the end, the public perception is you are dumping contaminated material in my backyard. Because that's what the dredge material is for the most part. It is contaminated to some extent. And we've overcome that a bit in New Jersey because we're putting them up on brownfields in industrial areas, and they're capped and they're being put to beneficial reuse. But the idea of aquatic disposal of dredge material is a tough obstacle to overcome in communities. And we use the rock that has come out of the blasting for the beds of our oyster reefs. So there's that, and we know the sand's being used, but you've got that big chunk in the middle of the kind of the black muck that comes out that is very difficult to manage, and that's where we're going to be headed when we go into maintenance of these channels. So it's a challenge, but these groups are reasonable, and you can talk to them, and they just need to be brought into the process.
I mean, it's true that the perception is a barrier. But I would also say that, for example, there's tons and tons of clean fill from the 2nd Avenue subway that could have been, that could have been, rather than the perception of it kind of being contaminated and dumped. But it seems like if somehow we were able to get in front of everyone, or by creating a vision, and not necessarily couching it as like, well, we need to remove or we need to dispose of this excess infrastructural dredge. It seems like that there would be a big potential to kind of try to reset the conversation. But I also had a question for Dave in that, and in relationship to your point about are we confined to historic footprint in a way? Because I'm very curious as to whether the National Park Service considers, this erosion that is man-made erosion to some extent, right? Because in fact man-made landscapes are being made by default, right? Because Jamaica Bay is turning into open, deep water. So that is a manufactured landscape to some degree. So I think that would be another way to try to change, which is that doing nothing is also a man-made condition, and that doing something is a man-made condition. Really seems like it's up to us to try to pull together that discussion so that you can utilize it.
Well, that's been the $50,000 question for the National Park Service at Gateway since it was created by an act of Congress 40 years ago. It's been a kind of a very challenging experience. I've worked at Gateway for something like 30 years of its 40 years. So it's been very challenging to fit Gateway into the model of the national park system because, as I mentioned, in a traditional way, national parks manage natural processes. What's happening now is with the advent of people's realization that climates are changing and animal populations are changing, and standing back and no action is an action, as you said. So there's a lot more understanding of the fact that we need to get behind really making good, positive decisions about managing the resource going forward into the future, and not necessarily just standing back and saying we have to fit the current environment into the footprint of the past. And my colleagues at the Corps here, and they know that for many years they've had the National Park Service has been viewed as kind of dragging our feet and making what was thought of as reasonable decisions about restoration projects, particularly in Jamaica Bay, because we weren't clear what restoration really meant in Jamaica Bay. And I think we're becoming a lot more open to experimentation and looking at different types of visions. Even some things like looking at oyster restoration in Jamaica Bay has been something that the National Park Service has been reluctant to engage in because it wasn't clear we're a relatively conservative organization. We are, the National Park System is. And maybe that's good in some degree, and maybe in an urban environment, it's not quite as good.
I guess, well, the question I was going to ask has been partially answered. A lot of what you guys have said, and we're really interested in this notion of when somebody goes from being an observer to a participant, when communities as a maybe diffuse sort of form of agency becomes, actually takes that step to actually engage with it. And I think a lot of the dialogue has talked about information, the informed citizen as making that crossover, whether it's through anger or information or, whatever that is. But I guess it's a twofold question of what are the sort of tools you guys personally know or moments of when that cross has been made, when somebody's actually becoming a participant and actually doing something, or in a more visceral way, like in an embodied way, like what are instances of that versus just knowledge? I think Dave touched on that a little bit in terms of if you're a birder or something like that, but sort of those more embodied kind of ways of getting people engaged.
I would just encourage Debbie to talk about the Oyster Gardening project because, in my view, kind of coming from the Chesapeake Bay area and knowing Baykeeper's work with oyster gardening, to me, I think you can sense my kind of frustration, frankly, like speechlessness in some ways, because these dredge projects are frankly of a scale of infrastructure that is beyond the scale of one person planting a piece of spartina, even though that can happen. But these big, effective projects that would make a difference in Phil's model are these large-scale projects. But I think the oyster gardening project is a really interesting hybrid of that, partially because these cages are placed throughout the Chesapeake Bay or throughout the harbor, and these oysters are kind of confined, the live oysters are confined in their cage, but in fact, they are dispersing larvae into the water. And so where, in the cases where us as landscape architects have been able to remake the edges of the harbor so that it's not a solid bulkhead wall, and you have kind of riprap, or you have shoals, that sort of thing, many of these oyster colonies we have to keep it kind of secret, but have sort of begun to come back. So, to me, I think that's an amazing example of small-scale dispersed action actions that are cumulative.
Right. I mean, much of the advocacy work that we do is very intangible for people to understand, right? So there's not a big connection to the harbor for many of the folks that our constituency is. We have folks in Bayonne who don't get down to Sandy Hook, don't visit that's just not where they are. And until we started the Oyster Gardening program, which is volunteers who get a floating net of oysters. They're called seed oysters, they're like this big, maybe a few hundred, and then they're in charge of them for over the course of several months. On a regular basis, they take them out, they measure them, check for mortality. And so we got involved with the Bayonne school system in New Jersey, and that was sometimes the first time that the students had gone down to the little zone within their peninsula of Bayonne, and that's really shocking. But it's because I think you have to have something that's tangible that people can see and understand and feel. When we lost our oyster program in New Jersey, people were so upset. They came out of the woodwork to come out and support us because they understood. They could see the oyster, they understood what it meant, they understood the significance of it. Right now, we have another big combined sewer campaign in New Jersey. We have litigation with the state. People don't see that as much. They don't see the dirty water, or they're not in the waterways to understand how it impacts them from a recreational sense. And so it's been much harder for us to engage the public in a meaningful way in that. So I think Kate makes a good point is, it has to impact someone. It has to make them feel it's in their backyard and something they can, feel, touch, and maybe, our founding director used to say, get a little wet and dirty about. So I think that's a good point about how people move from being, observing to being a participant in things. And it could be anything from standing up in a public meeting, writing a letter to the editor, calling their congressperson. That's a small shift, but that means you're participating, and that's what we're always trying to get at.
I think that engaging community members in implementing infrastructure projects addresses many issues beyond just the sort of the physical improvements to the environment, reduced stormwater in the sewer system, reduced sewage in places like the Gowanus Canal and the Hudson River. As many people lament, we're living in a time of diminished financial resources, or at least it seems that way. We're living in an era of sort of decreased physical activity and increased disconnectedness from nature, especially in urban environments. And by engaging people in these projects, in building them and maintaining them, oyster gardens or gorilla bioswales or bird houses along the Gowanus Canal, whatever. We're addressing all of those issues, I think, in small but not insignificant ways. And there's a real need for spreading these forms of infrastructure that are soft infrastructure, sort of moving beyond engineered solutions, but building oyster beds or archipelagos or whatever, bioswales, green roofs that address real significant environmental issues, but in softer kind of non-engineered ways. There's going to be a maintenance burden that accompanies all of these installations, and by treating these places as thinking of them as like community gardens in a sense, you can you can get people really excited about gardening, because there's really a lack of opportunity, I think, for people to get dirty and build things. And these are all skills and activities that I think a lot of us that had the benefit of growing up in the suburbs or maybe in a rural place really enjoyed. But it's an activity, these are activities that a lot of people don't have access to in cities. And so I think that by engaging community members in implementing infrastructure of this kind, it can be a really valuable experience for those reasons.
If someone can figure out how to engage the public in a really good way to become stewards, I would really like to know. It is very hard. It is really hard because people have. In my experience, I deal a lot with with local people who are local to the park, and their interests are local. Their interests are in what they know and what they see and what they can touch and how they, and how it interacts with them. And information, information today is just everywhere. People get their information from all kinds of sources, and a lot of times the information isn't necessarily, in my opinion, necessarily the correct information. Science is not necessarily at the top of everybody's list to really get ahead of the science. There's a lot of difficulties there. So I don't know if there's one way to interact with the public or engage the public or make the public become interested in stewardship. I think there probably are as many different ways as there are audiences. Connecting with children is really critical. That is really, if we can figure out ways of really getting children engaged in environmental protection and understanding what the science of conservation is about, that's excellent. Getting good information out to stakeholders and community leaders so that they understand the benefit of getting involved to them directly is absolutely critical. And before starting out on a project, making sure that you've done your homework and engaged the affected audiences so that they become your allies and not necessarily people who don't think that what you're doing is in the best interest of everybody is really important. Just getting good information, pretty solid, get your science together, get a good communications program together. That's absolutely critical. Because we've gone down the road the other way, where we felt we were doing something that how could anybody have a problem with this particular activity to improve the resource, and all of a sudden people are coming out of the woodwork saying your science is bad. They're not doing the right thing.
So my research area is one where it's easier. I mean, it's much more. It's easier to get people concerned about the marshes in Jamaica Bay if you can show them that with flooding in their neighborhood. So it can get through to people, but since it hasn't happened in 100 years, there's that level to it where it's sort of like a 50-year flood that's going to cause a big. Irene was a 20-year flood event, so if you add a foot onto it, maybe that's a 50-year flood event. You start flooding subways and people's yards a lot worse than we did. But so there's one thing I look at. In one way, my job is to get people to see what could happen, as I mentioned before. Another thing I think I'm preparing for is what happens if we do get the 50-year, or 100-year, or 500-year flood event. Then this whole problem where we can't have big vision will go away, and suddenly there will be demand for doing something big. And that's what happened this past year with Irene up in the mountains and up in tributaries of the Hudson, where they had whole neighborhoods get washed away. And now the sad thing is they didn't have it planned in place. They hadn't thought about it much. And they basically put rock up and made canals out of certain rivers up there that are just rock, and it's just like a channel. And no ecological value really. And they even had steamrollers and things doing the job. So that's another level of what we are doing is, I take part in the fact that if we did have a disaster, at least we're doing the thinking of what could be done afterward.
Well, I think the other important thing about, I do get frustrated at this constant line of there's no money, because there is money, as we all know. It's a historic oil profits, and there just happens to not be public money, and there's not a certain value set that's aligned with the money that's out there. So obviously, I think we could all have a little pushback on that. But the big promise in sort of the Stevens Institute model too is recasting some of these projects as infrastructure projects, and rather than as small scale. I think there's this combination of both ends of the spectrum. But to visualize and to have officials and decision makers and people who are writing budgets. We're all talking about Mary now too. marrying back, but people who are in, you know, positions of power in city agencies and in federal funding agencies, to be able to have, frankly, parameters and tools with which one can run scenarios and make decisions. It seems like a very powerful tool, I think, for the New York Harbor to be able to start to kind of work and develop some projects.
I agree.
So we wanted to open it up to the audience for a couple questions.
Yeah, one aspect of harbors and estuaries that we haven't heard about much today is that of recreational boating. And it seems to me that here we have a group of people who are out and engaged, who are ready-made activists. So where do they fit into all of this?
You know, speaking from an organization that has 4 boats, including one that got stalled out in the harbor yesterday, I think, you know, what's going to be interesting as we develop the port and we bring in these larger ships, it's a busy port. But I am concerned, and there's other advocates that are concerned, is that the recreational users are going to get squeezed out. So just as we're bringing recreational users back in, people are swimming more, the water quality is improving, we don't go in after rain, clearly. You know, like you look at something like the Kilman Cove, the tidal strait there, it's very narrow, very heavily industrialized, but there's kayakers there, and small boats, and you know, you need to have them coexist, and I don't think folks who need to make the decisions about that have really thought about that. I don't know if that's what you're trying to get at, but you know, we want more people to be using the water so that the standards get better. You know, the more people I can show are using the water for primary use, the higher I can have the water quality standards, and the more pollution I can get out of the water. So, but it's a tension that's there, and it's probably going to get worse as we, you know, do this dredging.
I'm really glad you raised that question and that you touched on it. In the Gowanus Canal, we have one organization that practices recreational water use, and it's the Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club. And they operate free programs where people can come down and canoe in the canal. And a lot of people would argue that that's an irresponsible activity, but I think it's been demonstrated that it's relatively safe. I think the EPA said you can spend 23 days submerged in the Gowanus Canal per year, and you're okay, and you won't. But that 24th day is when a tumor grows on your arm. But seriously, what's really amazing about the way the water quality regulations work is that if people aren't using the body of water, then you are allowed to pollute it more. And so it's really important to the health of the Gowanus Canal and other bodies of water around New York City, like the Newtown Creek, that we get as many people in that water as possible and then document it and tell the New York State DEC that people are using this body of water, and so you have to raise the water quality designation because right now the Gowanus Canal and Newtown Creek have the 2 lowest designations in New York State. The lowest permissible, and it's kind of interesting. It seems a little backwards that you wouldn't try to raise the quality of the water before you let people recreate in it. But whatever, that's the way the rules work. And so it's very important, I think, to have recreational users in our harbor and the tributaries around it. So.
Recreational boaters, in my experience, have been some of the strongest advocates for preservation, protection of the waters in New York. And I think the biggest issue we face is that a lot of these recreational boaters don't have the access. There's really good access for people with a lot of money, and they can afford to use marinas and things like that. But the access for the kayakers and canoeists and whatnot has been fairly meager. And I'd say over the last 5 years, that's really been acknowledged. And there's been a lot more attention paid to non-motorized access, particularly kayaking, creating kayaking trails and kayaking access sites. And lots of non-profit organizations have got involved in teaching people skills on the water, and that's creating new stakeholders and new advocates for for protection in the New York Harbor. That's a good thing.
This is something that Kate mentioned, talking about getting in front of the perception of dredge. So I have like 2 really quick stories. So if you go to Green Bay, Wisconsin, you go to Brown County port operators, you go to a building that is shared with the solid waste department. So if you want to talk to the head of the port, you basically get to hang out next to dump trucks of garbage all day long. So if you want to use this material as a resource, you're already preconditioned to assume it's trash and probably dirty. I met a dredger in the Sioux Locks in Sault Ste. Marie, and I told him I was interested in how we could reuse dredge material, and he said, good luck with that, considering every clamshell of material here is full of lampreys. If you can imagine the perception of people like dumping mud on a site and it's full of basically freshwater leeches, right? So these are the things that we have to deal with. Like, and I agree that we have to find a way to make this material seem valuable. And I think that I think that at least for me, the idea of us as designers, and this has come out in questions today, and this is more of an observation today as well. There have been questions like, can I make a triangular geotube? And the answer is kind of like, yeah. And can I stack them in piles? And the answer is like, well, yeah. And why does the size of the islands have to be kind of lumpy? And it's like, well, that's the way they were historically. And I think that as designers, like one of our primary means of agency is that we can show intentionality in what we're doing, which is, and that's what all the designers in the room are kind of asking these weird questions like, well, could I actually make this look designed? As opposed to making a lumpy landscape lumpier. And so I think, and as a way of drawing public perception to this as well, showing people that this is a landscape that's actually been designed, and it's been designed with a material that is a resource and not a waste product, seems like one way. And I understand that it's not necessarily, that could be pro or con, it could have ecological implications as well, but I'm just saying that I think that that might be one way as designers that we can have a role to play in this whole process, is making landscapes that look intentionally designed. So people want to know, someone designed this, what they designed it out of? Well, we obviously made it out of triangular geotubes or whatever. So I just think that that's something that we need to think about, and something that I think with the people that are managing this process are ones that are really just trying to, they're trying to get rid of the material, they're trying to recycle the material, but you can tell there's never been designers involved. And I'll tell you, I've said in these meetings actually in other cities, and this is the only time you're gonna get a designer and a dredger in the same effing room anywhere in the country. But here, like, it's happening. And so I think that's really great, and it's something that we need to make sure is encouraged in other parts of the country. So.
I hired a landscape architect, right?
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's why New York is
I have a question about scale, because I think it's really interesting. We started the day with these unbelievable, it was like 30 Empire State Buildings and, you know, this height of Mount Everest and a number, like dollar figures that are so large that I've actually intentionally wiped them from my head because they would give me nightmares. But, and now we're ending the day at a very different scale, and yet, we're also talking about, oh, but we need a vision for these things and get out ahead and come up with a big vision. I'm just curious if you can have community participation at the scale of a harbor, and it, you know, like, how do you break it down, and how do you make that happen?
I mean, I feel like the way that all of this hard infrastructure got built in the first place was by the CCC, which was basically citizens who were amped up because this was, you know, the way to show their civic pride. And I don't think that soft infrastructure has to be small, like us planting salt marsh grass. Like, I think it can be large cores of people employed by the state, but with coordination. Yeah.
I think one example, you know, that Dave mentioned too, is that part of the harbor dredging, we're actually putting sand now on 2 additional islands, Blackwall and Brewer's Bar. And what's different compared to the first island that was restored, they were actually core projects. What makes these 2 islands different are these are what we call beneficial use placed areas that 100% been paid, not federal dollars, came from New York State DEC and New York City DEP. So we're actually leaving it to a point that we're going to rough grade it, and community folks, locals, are being band together to actually, they collected seed in September, and they're going out now and physically going out and doing the planting. next season. So now going back to what Dave said, that was the first, I guess, bigger scale thing that the Corps is going to be involved in, that we're going to help also, that they're going to, so they get the appreciation of what's going on out there. So I think that's one good example that's we're actually trying to do.
I think that community projects can be implemented on a large scale. I can't think of an example one beyond maybe what you just mentioned, but it just requires a different set of skills. It requires a lot of organization. It requires a lot of knowledge transfer, and it just requires experts teaching people about what they're going to be doing and helping to facilitate that project. And you know, it can be a very efficient process, but the burden is on training your coordinators and the people who are sort of overseeing the process. It can't just be anarchy, obviously.
I also think there's this just to toggle back to this issue of value, and I think Catherine showed the situation in the Mississippi River Delta, where I think everyone in that region has a sense of the extreme value of every piece, particle of sediment that is just being lost over the continental shelf, and that used to be building land and creating productive landscapes, and landscapes that were, you know, home to fish and crawfish and oysters and blue crabs, and all that land is disappearing. That's an American scale problem. And so, I mean, I definitely think this notion of obviously addressing the issue of contamination, but understanding that sediment is what is a land building and has incredible value for all these landscapes is also, you know, a cry that needs to be heard.
Like the Dutch. They like the Dutch. We could learn from the Dutch. They appreciate their land.
Maybe one more question? Or we could just wrap up? Okay. Everybody's tired. Yeah. It's that time.
So thanks again, everybody. Kind of one last thing before we break for wine and all that exciting stuff. This is a continuing project. Obviously, we've got a tour tomorrow that we're extraordinarily excited about, so I hope everybody can come. There's still spots available. Tickets are on the website, all that good stuff. And one other last part of this that I wanted to bring up was the sort of ongoing documentary efforts for this. And Ben and Alex over there in the corner, Alex has been recording the audio all day. All this is going to be available online, but we're also doing, if any of you saw the kind of promo video that was advertising this, there's going to be a much longer, 15, 20-minute version of that that they're working on. So if you want to, you may be, especially panelists, folks like that, you might say.
Thanks. Yep. As Stephen mentioned, Alex over there and I produced the short trailer for the event, which if you haven't seen, you can see it on their website. And here's some more of Stephen's voice, which was likened by at least one commenter to Brad Pitt. Super interesting day. It was great to hear from everyone up front and in the audience, and look forward to kind of continuing to work with these guys and the opportunity to learn more about your work and show it to more people, because it's super important, and I think there's a lot that's really worthwhile to look at and kind of spread around. So thanks.
Okay, thanks everybody. Night.